Hello everyone, this is Tim, and this video is going to be hopefully the first in a series where I talk about Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, Middle-earth, and sundry topics of interest. I'm going to call this series Tolkien Quest because it's been a while. I've kind of gotten away from my Tolkien fandom, and I want to basically get back into it again. And I want to thank Fell Voice. He left a few comments on one of my videos. I don't even remember which one, and he mentioned that no one is doing Lord of the Rings videos that he knows of, especially within our little community that deals with RPGs. So the first book that I wanted to talk about is Tolkien and the Great War by John Garth. And I don't know if you can tell there, but that scene on the front is a scene from World War One. You see all the broken trees, the mud and the muck, the boards and that have been set up. People are walking on. It's very, very gray, dark, it sort of sets the mood, I think, for the book. I've read this once before, and in the last 3 or 4 days I read through it again. I had some time at work, and I just churned through it. And I want to talk about some of my thoughts and some of the things that jumped out at me, some things that I think, would be interesting to listen to. So in the summer of 1911, they basically formed a tea club at their school, and then later that tea club went over to the Barrows stores, and they had this sort of get together. So they called themselves the Tea Club and Barovian Society, based on the Barrows stores. So the TCBS was their group. Now the four members that I put their names at the beginning of this video were the main four. There were other people that were in and out of the club, people that were there that weren't as focused and weren't as literary minded. So in the end, it basically just came down to the four that were the main TCBS members. The quote at the beginning, by 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. Uh, it, I think it's Tolkien's grief, his his being able to get through the sad things that have happened in his life to go on to greater things. That it has always interested me in his life. His father died, his mother died, he was an orphan. He was taken in and raised by a priest. He was born over in South Africa, and then he went back to England. And there's lots of things in his life that I just found interesting. Edith Bratt was his love interest, but he wasn't allowed to date her until he was, I believe, 21 years of age, whenever he was basically left to his own self, his own choices, whenever he became, I guess basically a man in the eyes of where he was living. And he wanted to respect the priest that had raised him, so I think the priest's wishes were he didn't want him to date for a while. And later he ended up marrying Edith. But that period of time where he was in love with this girl and couldn't see her, I mean, that also speaks sort of wonders. It speaks volumes, I guess, of some of the stuff that he went through. And in addition to all that, he was in World War One, trench warfare, the Battle of the Somme. And while I'm not a very big military history buff, I do know about that battle. And by reading this book, I learned more. What's interesting about this book is it's kind of a blending of different things. You get various writings from Tolkien that haven't been published elsewhere. You get writings from some of the other TCBS members that, as far as I know, really haven't been published all that many in very many places, and they're not really well known. And it's very kind of I guess haunting is the word I'm looking for here, where you're reading the words of dead men. And Tolkien has now passed on. All four members of the core members of the TCBS have passed on. So it's interesting to read their personal letters, some quotes that are thrown in there, some of the things that they wrote. Um, in some ways, it's kind of like hearing the voices of the dead speaking to you from times gone by. Some of the things they said about the war, where they were at, the trenches, the things that they went through. Tolkien had trench fever, and his limbs would ache. He got sick. He had fevers all the time. He was in and out of hospitals a lot of the time during the war, and he had to move around a lot. They kept stationing him in different places, and I think he said that he lived like a very nomadic lifestyle during the war because they kept trying to strengthen him up and get him ready for battle again, and he just never was able to return to battle once again. But he was at the Battle of the Somme in France. So I'll stop there for a second. Gonna share some quotes with you guys here. Honor and glory cast an overarching glamour over war and sport, as if real combat could be a heroic and essentially decent affair. Also, in those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in. Just talking about the pressure that they had to sign up and join the war. Also, a real taste for fairy stories was awakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. And that was Tolkien. There's one thing particularly interesting that I find about the TCBS and its members. They had a sort of driving ambition and high minded goal that I don't think that I've ever had in my life. They just had this driving force, and in a quote, it basically sums up that sort of philosophy and mindset. For in moments of seriousness, the key members of the TCBS felt that they were a force to be reckoned with, not a grammar school clique, but a republic of individuals, with the potential to do something truly significant in the wider world. They wanted to leave the world a better place than when they came into it. They wanted to change things. They wanted to shake things up. They wanted to share their expertise, their knowledge, their creativity. And what's really wild about that is they did achieve that. One of their members achieved that. And it's pretty, I don't know, it's inspirational to me to have a group of people to set out with that goal, to have that goal and to have it achieved. I don't know. It just sort of it hits home for me. It's very interesting that that actually was possible, that it happened. Here's a quote by A. E. Housman: "East and west on fields forgotten, bleach the bones of comrades slain, lovely lads and dead and rotten, none that go return again." The book talks a little bit about how authors who had gone through World War I had this sort of bleak realism where they did not emphasize the glory and honor that previous propaganda and writings had. They sort of went the complete opposite direction. They wanted to hit you with the horrific, the morbid, death in all of its smelly, gruesome glory. I guess glory is not the right word there, but just a more realistic approach to it, a negative sort of true account of what war is, the hell that is war. But Tolkien sort of went in a different vein. He dealt with these things, but he also kept some of the glory, the sense of achievement that soldiers would sometimes get, that rising feeling and energy, nervousness, anxiety, all those things. He sort of blended them in together. He didn't hit you just with one or the other, but he hit you with both. You get both sides of it. He incorporated those themes, the things that he went through. Some have even said like the tanks on the Battle of Somme made him think of dragons. There's lots of things that he saw that while he didn't, it's not like the Lord of the Rings and the battle of it isn't World War One, it isn't World War Two, but you can't help but see that war affected him, that he included those elements into his mythology, into his stories. To understand, we're talking about some of his ideas. He had this great literary background. He understood a lot of these older, archaic stories that a lot of times weren't translated into English. He got to see those things, these various, like the Kalevala, the Finnish stories, Beowulf, all these different tales that were bouncing around in his head, and he took the best bits and he put them down into a story that modern day readers would be interested in. He used some of the themes, the northern philosophies, of while we might lose the battle, we're going to fight until the end. We are going to do the best we can. We're not going to give into despair. We're going to die fighting. Things like that. Very heroic sort of things that he brought forward and put into his epic. When the core members of the TCBS got together, there was this sense that they could achieve greatness. That by helping each other out, by bouncing ideas off each other, by sharing their verse and writings and thoughts and philosophies, they could do great things. And from what I got from this book, whenever they would have a council, like the Council of London, when they all got together and discussed things, it's basically like a meeting after the fact, after they had moved on from school. There was this sense of energy and a direction, a driving force within them to create something, to write something that the others would find entertaining and good and powerful. And a lot of times they would be very harsh with each other, especially Wiseman to Tolkien. They had this yin and yang kind of relationship where Wiseman was a Protestant and Tolkien was a Catholic, and they would kind of bicker about things back and forth. But in the early days, that sense of fighting about things, they relished in it, they enjoyed it, that they were so different and could still be friends. But later on in life, after the other two members of the core TCBS died, they drifted apart. Those differences seemed to, instead of be something enjoyable to fight about, became a schism, and they really didn't deal with each other. They didn't talk with each other. Tolkien died first, and then Wiseman died later, and that made me kind of sad too. But I've seen those kind of things in my own life where people grow up, they grow apart, and they go their own ways. Another thing about this book that I think is very powerful is the idea of this core group of people that are so close to each other that they're almost family. They're almost like a band of brothers. They're bonded together with their interests, and this made me think of a role playing group. If you have a role playing group that goes on for years, you trust each other, you spend a lot of time with each other, and it's sad when those groups finally collapse and fall apart or break apart. I've never been a part of a group that close that had a member die, and I can only imagine how greatly that must have affected Tolkien and Wiseman and just the other members. The first two members, Robert Gilson and Jeffrey Smith, they died in World War One, and like I said, Tolkien and Wiseman lived to older age. It's 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 interesting to see because I think a lot of those friendships that he had influenced the characters that he had. I think Tolkien said that he was most like Faramir because he spent so much time in the hospital with trench fever, and I can kind of see that. It kind of makes sense. He was bookish, Faramir, and he ends up marrying, and Tolkien did as well to Edith Bratt. It's interesting to just see these words of dead men, these haunting phrases of the hell of war, the things that they were forced to do for, as some of them put it, a few acres of mud at the Battle of the Somme. The trench warfare went back and forth, really gaining nothing. Just the dead kept piling up on either side. It makes you think, well, what are we fighting for? What's going on here? But there was that nationalistic impulse and drive in all the TCBS members. They wanted to do their part for Britain. So that's there as well, that patriotism. Like I said, this book is an interesting mix of the fiction that they wrote, military history, where they were at different times, how close sometimes they were at different units. They were on the same field, didn't know it. Um, the author goes into some painstaking detail about where they were, what time, what was going on. And as you're reading it, at least for me, I kept hoping to see them get back together again. Those councils, as they call them, kind of like the White Council in Lord of the Rings, where they could share ideas and read their poetry to one another and to help each other out with their creative endeavors. And as I was reading the book, you know, those meetings were fewer and far between. Sometimes only one or two of the members would be able to get together during war or after. Wiseman and Tolkien, like I said, kind of drifted apart. It's just I guess haunting is a good way to describe this book. It it impacted me. It made me appreciate those stories of the hobbits and the Lord of the Rings more. I can kind of see Gilson and Smith and Wiseman and even Tolkien in places with the way they describe things. And that could be me just painting what I've read and just putting my own input in there. But that's how I see it. I think that Tolkien, without those friends in his life, wanted to include them in his masterpiece. He wanted them to be a part of it. He wanted the TCBS to change the world in some aspects, in some ways. And I think they did. I've said before that reading The Lord of the Rings, I think, saved my life. There was a period of time where being able to read and escape and go off into Middle Earth really got me through some things that I don't know if I could have gotten through otherwise. While I have not been a soldier in war, I have had um, my father was dating a woman for a while who had a son, and he ended up dying in Iraq. And I had a cousin who also died in Iraq. My father had a cousin who died in Vietnam. So there are members of my family that have died in service to their country. So that sort of patriotic vibe really kind of struck home to me as well. But there's that sense of loss, that sense of you're never going to see them again. And I can kind of understand, I think, only partially maybe where Tolkien was coming from. They also said that it bothered him the rest of his life, that he missed his friends, and that sadness of not being able to be with them, to talk with them, to interact with them, was a constant thing for the rest of his life. I think when I look and I read about Tolkien's life, it makes me think about my own life. It makes me think of the things that I've gone through, and in some ways that they're not exactly the same as Tolkien's, but I can I think I know where he was coming from, even though our lives are very different. I don't know what the right word is, but I felt closer to him as a result of reading this book and of reading all the other books that he's put out, his fiction, and the things that you learn from behind the scenes about his life. So in the end, if you like military history, if you want to learn more about Tolkien, if you want to see what it was like to be a soldier in the First World War, I highly recommend this book. Another great thing about it is that you have this core member, these four members of this group, and the author John Garth takes you through and tells you how they all went through the war, what happened to them, where were they stationed, why were they moved, what happened, what transpired, um, and then you learn of their deaths as you go through the book, and in some ways it's almost like they died. I can put myself in Tolkien's shoes, I think, and perhaps see what that would have been like for him. I don't know. I'm probably rambling and not really making much sense here, but um, it is a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. This is the second time that I've gone through and read it. I wanted to get refreshed on some things before I did the video here, but if you read the book, please let me know your comments below, what you thought of it. If you are a soldier, if you've been in the military and you've read it, maybe it also has some impact on you, and I'd like to hear about that as well. That spirit of the North, that philosophy that I talked about before, can be summed up in an Old English poem, The Battle of Maldon. Will shall be the sterner, heart the bolder, spirit the greater as our strength lessens. Tolkien asserted that fairy stories, fantasy stories, etc., provide the means of recovery, escape, and consolation to its readers that they need. And I greatly agree with that statement. I think that, like I said, being able to do all those things with The Lord of the Rings helped me out when I was younger. And I always go back and dip into the well whenever I'm feeling a bit down and run down and things aren't going the way that I would like them to in my life. I always take a little jaunt off to Middle Earth, and sometimes I shed a tear, and I'm able to continue with things. G.B. Smith wrote, "Who knows what is hidden in the black darkness between now and the spring? It is the most anxious hour of my life." And this was written during the war. And he also wrote, "I am now 21 years of age, and cannot help doubting whether I shall ever be 22." That sense of fear and dread and the unknown of what the future holds, I think, it is kind of frightening to think about, to put yourself in that position, to have death all around you and not sure when it's going to claim you or if. I think in those situations, perhaps even that hope is probably a little bit maddening. That hope of surviving, of being able to return, and in that TCBS spirit to make the world a better place. Will you survive to get to that point to continue to do that or not? That's something to think about. Gilson wrote, "It is a strange and dreary looking place, wasteland, and shattered trees and houses. What most impresses me at first is the appalling expenditure of human labor on merely hiding each other from each other's devilishness. I had never grasped it with my imagination. It is one of the very saddest sights I have ever seen. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not there to say them, if such be my lot." That that sense of perhaps knowing that he was going to die when he wrote that makes that very powerful to me. I can only imagine what it was like for Tolkien to read it. The book talks a little bit about Frodo Baggins when he returns to the Shire, how this is Tolkien's way of showing the disillusionment of the returned soldier to home, how he has to somehow try to fit back into a life that he might not fit into anymore, that the experiences that he has gone through have changed him to the point that he cannot even enjoy the things that he fought to protect, the place that he left, and when he returns, it's almost like it's not the same place, even though it is the exact same place. It's him that's changed. I can only imagine what that must be like for soldiers that go off and see death and violence and such gruesome displays, and then to have to return home once again. That post-traumatic stress disorder that they talk about a lot, I think has a lot to do with that. And while I haven't been a soldier in war, I've gone through some things. Could probably even talk about it here, where I was young and I almost saw my father kill himself. And I think I probably suffered a lot from that. I was, I think, 9 at the time. So I think in some ways I could probably understand to a limited degree what some soldiers go through, seeing just horrible things happen to people that they love or almost happen. And I think just my life has sort of made me appreciate Tolkien's writings. Tolkien's writings speak to me. That underlying despair and sadness, in some ways, I think is beautiful. Probably because it speaks to me. It reminds me of my own life. So when I read these tales of the things that they went through during the war, while it's different from my own life, I can empathize, and my heart goes out to them. It goes out to all soldiers, really, those who get placed in these places of danger and violence and they have to survive. Wilson also wrote, "When it comes down to single human beings, I can hardly bear the horror of this war. Men you have known and lived with and worked with for 18 months are carried away on stretchers bleeding. It makes me feel like peace at any price. It is all just cold-blooded and horrible." Just to throw some numbers in about the Battle of Somme, on the first day alone, there were 57,000 casualties, and on the second day, there were 30,000 more. The final total was just staggering. It's something that you could probably look into. It's easily found on the internet, but yeah, I'm not going to dwell too much on the historical facts. About Tolkien's work and writings, Gilson wrote, We believe in your work, we others, and we recognize with pleasure our own finger in it. And it makes you think about it wasn't just Tolkien. It's almost like the spirits of his friends were with him, are part of the story, uh, were there to help him with his writings, were there to motivate him and help him produce the very impressive things that he had managed to put down on paper. It, in some ways, I think, is their, their immortality that they were a part of something greater than themselves. From 1911 to 1918, Tolkien had remained in no place for more than a few months during that entire time. That just shows you what kind of nomadic lifestyle he led. After he married Edith, he also wanted to have her close to him, and I think she wanted to do the same. And I believe she lived in about 22 different locations to try to be as close to him as possible. The whole idea of a marriage surviving a war and the wife left at home while the husband is out in danger is also something I think about. I wonder what my marriage would be like if I was on the battlefront and my wife was left at home. It makes you think. In the spring of 1917, Tolkien and Edith were able to live together for a while, and it talks about how they were able to walk in this sort of forest glade. In those days, her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have ever seen them, and she could sing and dance. And later, when she died, he had the name Luthien put on her grave. And when Tolkien died, he had the name Baron on his grave. And whenever I read that story, I always think of them. I always think of that younger couple in love, dealing with all the world and its problems, and it's just beautiful. It's like it has the sad sort of backdrop, but the beauty's on top of it. You know, it's a wonderful sort of image to see. Luthien dancing in the forest, and Baron just staring and just enraptured with the beauty that's before him. After the TCBS stopped to be a force in his life, whenever two of the main members died, and Wiseman and Tolkien had their sort of like parting separate ways, C.S. Lewis and the Inklings stepped in to fill that void. And it's interesting to see that that group, in some ways, was very much like the TCBS, and that it inspired all those members that were part of it. John Ron Ruel Tolkien talked about war, and he called it animal horror. The utter stupid waste of war, not only material but moral and spiritual, is so staggering to those who have to endure it, and always was, despite the poets, and always will be, despite the propagandists. With the accusation that his writings and fantasy and fairy stories in general are an escape and escapism is bad, he replied, "Escape is very practical and may even be heroic. Critics tend to confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter." Tolkien liked the idea of the eucatastrophe, which was a sudden good turning in a story. And right before the eucatastrophe, there usually is this sense of dread, despair, of giving up all hope. And then there's that sudden change, that sudden turn of events, where all things were dark and dreary and were perhaps going to end. They change, and there's this uplifting moment of sheer wonder as things take on a better perspective. Things have hope. It looks like things are going to get better, and they do. Tolkien suggests that we should go on whether we can or we can't, with his tales of heroic and hard won partial victories. That in the face of struggle and things thrown at your way that you can't handle, you just need to keep moving. You need to move up Mount Doom step by step, fighting and scraping and crawling. Sometimes when you don't even know why you're doing it. And that message rings very true for me. It speaks volumes to my heart. Tolkien found the concept of the ignoble finding ennoblement through hardship and fear to be greatly moving, where individuals are greater than the sum of their parts. They often talk a little bit in the book about Lord of the Rings and what it's like to read it. And I like this little part here especially. Lord of the Rings is a light drawn from ancient sources to illuminate a darkening modern world. So hopefully this video wasn't too disjointed and all over the place, but I didn't know how else to do it. I hopefully didn't get too personal there. I hope it didn't bother any of you, but I wanted to be open and honest. And Tolkien is one of those things that uh, affects me greatly. So thanks for listening. And if you want to look at the book, I'm sure you can find it online or on Amazon or at your friendly local store. But Tolkien and the Great War. It's a great read. I greatly enjoyed it.